Hey there, this video is going to be a low light or high ISO performance comparison between three cameras, the Canon R3, the Sony FX3, and the Sony A1, which is what I'm shooting on right now. Now the first thing I had to do was decide on which modes to shoot all these cameras in so that I could compare them. And what I decided on was trying to shoot it in the highest quality non-RAW mode in all these cameras. So for the R3, I shot it in 4K All-I UHD, which is a 5.6K oversample. And the reason I decided to not shoot in DCI, which is a 6K oversample, is that the Sony cameras don't have DCI and I want it to all sort of be the same. Of course, I shot it in C-Log3. On the FX3, I shot an XAVC SI 4K and S-Log3 using the flexible ISO setting. I can't use Cine EI because with Cine EI, I can only use the base ISO, so I wanted to be able to change the ISO. For the A1, there's two different options, and I will compare them and we'll talk about those, but I shot it in XAVC SI 4K and also the XAVC HS 8K, and this was all in S-Log3. So let me explain how I do these tests so you can understand what's going on here. So the big thing is getting the exposure right, and the way I do this is using a gray card in zebras. So for Canon, using C-Log3, I aim for 35% IRE on my gray card, and for Sony with S-Log3, I shoot for 41%, and this is how I do it with all these tests. The way I get exposure is I basically keep the aperture and the shutter speed fixed, and everything's at 24 frames a second, and what I do then is, as I'm trying to raise the ISO, I then lower the key light to get the proper exposure on the gray card using zebras. That way I can test out the high ISO performance and getting accurate exposure for each camera at each setting. I also want to mention that I custom white balanced each camera using a gray card before I got started. Now let me talk about how I handle the footage in the computer. So after I brought the footage in, I graded each clip at ISO 800, and then I didn't change any of that for all of the different ISO values. So you will see some slight variations in exposure from clip to clip. Now, the other thing I want to mention is that when I graded it, I didn't use any LUTs at all. I just, added some contrast and saturation, just a basic grade to correct it. And then there were some slight white balance tweaks, but generally they were pretty close. The other thing to keep in mind with these tests is noise reduction. The Sony cameras, the A1 and the FX3, have built-in noise reduction that you can't adjust. The R3 has a high ISO noise reduction setting. You can change it from low to standard to high. I left it on standard, which is how it comes out of the box, because I figured it would be closer to how the Sony cameras work. In general, it's always best to keep the noise reduction down as much as possible in the camera and then adjust it in post. Also keep in mind that we're going to be doing some serious pixel peeping here and zooming in to see what's going on, but please keep in mind about the full-size images because that's really what matters at the end of the day. And to me, it's always a question with how the YouTube compression handles all this noise and stuff. But remember, you can go back and watch each section again and make your own assessment. We look at each camera individually and then we'll be comparing them against each other. So let's start with the R3. The R3 seems to perform really well. There's a couple things to note here. I'm wondering if there is some sort of second base ISO at 3200. It does seem to clean up there. And that's consistent with some of the other cameras from Canon, like the R5 and the R5C. The R5C technically does have a second base ISO of 3200, but the R5 does also clean up at 3200. I think the first hit of, heavier noise happens going from 6400 to 8000. And then I also noticed that at 10,000, it definitely cleans up a little bit more, but there's also a color shift going on here. And as you get up above 10,000, it's not so bad up until about 16,000, where after that, it starts to get a little bit noisier. Now, let's get on to testing the A1. So the A1 did really well, and there's a couple things I want to talk about here. First of all, I thought that the 8K and the 4K in terms of noise looked very, very similar. And if you don't know this, the 4K in the A1 is actually a line skipped or pixel bin thing. It's not an oversampling. So what I noticed though was that the noise was pretty consistent between the two different settings. So one thing to note here is that I've heard that the A1 has a second base ISO of 4000, and you can see it cleaning up a little bit here from 3200 to 4000, but not nearly the same amount as the R3 did. I also noticed that the first hit in terms of the noise creeping up really happens at from 8,000 to 10,000, although it is pretty well controlled up through 16,000 or so. So really solid performance from the A1, and also the fact that the 4K and the 8K in terms of noise looked pretty similar throughout the ISO range. Now let's take a look at the FX3. And the FX3 did a fantastic job, as you might expect, and keep in mind that the FX3 is going to give you the same performance as the A7S III. In general, I find the image to be very clean in terms of noise, but you can always tell there's a lot of noise reduction going on, which kind of keeps the noise under control, but it kind of smooths out the image a little bit, especially in the mid to higher level range. It is very noisy in that middle range from 3200 up to 10,000, and that's because it has a second base ISO of 12,800, and it does clean up really, really well, going from 10,000 to 12,800. And when you get above that, it does really, really well also. So most of us know that if you're looking for high ISOs of 12,800 or above, then cameras like the A7S III or the FX3 are going to be the camera that you're looking for. So now the big showdown, let's compare these three cameras. And the way I did this was I actually used the 4K in the A1 because it was so similar to the 8K. So take a look. All right, so what did you think of the showdown? I think it was pretty interesting, and there's definitely not a clear winner. But let's go through all the ISO ranges, and we'll talk about where each has strengths and weaknesses. But in general, they were pretty similar throughout most of the range. So starting off towards the bottom end of this at 2,000 and 2,500, I would say the best was the FX3, then the A1, then the R3, but they weren't that far off from each other. And keep in mind, I think a lot of the time with the FX3 and lowering the noise is because of the noise reduction. All right, so getting on to ISO 3200, I would say the R3 creeps ahead of the A1 just because it cleans up at 3200. Going on to ISO 4000 and 5000, I think the A1 and R3 just maybe switch spots, and the A1 is a little bit better than R3, but they're very similar. At 6400 up to 8000, I would say the A1 takes the lead over the FX3 and then the R3. And going up to 10,000, this is where the R3, I think, is the only time when it's winning in terms of the race. It looks a little bit cleaner than the A1 and the FX3. And of course, at 12,800 and up, the FX3 takes over. And I would say that the R3 definitely performs better than the A1 above 12,800. All right, so who's the winner here? Well, if you weren't keeping score through all that madness in the middle ISO range, I just have to say they're all great cameras. And it's really tough to tell what's going on with the noise reduction. And I also want to mention that I didn't add any sharpening in post, but it's tough to get all the settings in the camera exactly the same. It also seems like the noise reduction of the FX3 is pretty heavy, and I think that's what produces a slightly softer image. Now, one thing that did surprise me was that sort of ISO performance in that middle range with the A1 beating out the R3 in a lot of situations. And the reason why that was surprising to me is that the 4K in the A1, which is what I was using for that comparison, is a line skipped or pixel bin mode, so it's not an oversampling like it is in the R3. And generally, when you have an oversampling, it really does compress the noise and make a cleaner image. Now, of course, we totally expected at 12,800 and up, the FX3 was definitely the clear winner and definitely looked the best. And that's definitely no surprise having that much higher second base ISO. But in terms of that middle range of, let's say, 3,200 up to 10,000, I'd probably choose the A1 over the R3, but they were pretty similar and they both looked really, really good. Now, if you made it this far in the video, I want to give you a little bit of a bonus that really isn't part of the low light comparison, but I want to take a look at the base ISOs because I have all this footage. Now, let's take a look here. This is all at ISO 800, just so you can see what these cameras look like against each other, and they all look so good and so clean. I would take any of these images. One thing when you punch in, I noticed that the R3 is just slightly noisier than the A1 and the FX3, so anyways, just want to share that with you along with all this information. I think all these cameras are great. It really depends on where you need to use your camera. Again, if you need to be in that middle range, I think you'd be happy with the A1 or the R3. If you need to be in the high ISO range, often, of course, the FX3 is going to be a better camera for you. Hopefully you enjoyed this comparison. If you did, hit subscribe down below. It would be greatly appreciated. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.